Title: Beneath the Floorboards. The house had always been strange. Not haunted, not cursed, just wrong. It sat at the end of a winding road, swallowed by trees that seemed too eager to reclaim it. No matter the season, the air inside was thick, stifling, as if the house itself was holding something inside, something that shouldn't be let out. When Leah and her younger brother Sam moved in with their uncle after their parents' accident, they expected grief, not terror. But the house had other plans. It watched them. It waited. And at night, it whispered. Their parents' deaths had been labeled a freak accident, something the news barely covered before moving on. Their car had been found overturned on a deserted road, the metal twisted in impossible ways. No skid marks, no signs of another vehicle. The doors were still locked from the inside, yet their bodies were found yards away, as if something had pulled them out. The coroner's report was inconclusive. No one had an explanation. Leah had nightmares about it. Her mother's phone was never recovered, but sometimes, in the dead of night, Leah swore she could still hear it ringing. Once, in the middle of a storm, she checked her own phone for the time and saw a single unknown number had called her, 3:07 a.m., the exact time their parents had died. The first night was the worst. The air was thick, stifling, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The dim, yellow glow of the hallway light barely reached Leah's room, leaving the corners to swell with darkness. The bed was cold. The sheets smelled like dust and something damp. Outside, the wind rattled the trees, their branches scraping against the window like desperate fingers. A thud, then a scrape. Leah's breath hitched. She turned her head toward the door, but the house was silent again. Just old pipes, she told herself. Just the house settling, but the sensation of being watched crawled over her skin like unseen insects. She squeezed her eyes shut. Sleep. Just sleep. Then, just as she drifted off, she heard it again. A whisper. Sam had trouble sleeping. The house was unfamiliar, its walls pressing in on him like something alive. He lay in bed, curled under his blanket, staring at the ceiling. Every now and then, a soft creak echoed from the hallway, or the wind outside moaned through the trees. He told himself it was normal. Houses made noises, but then he heard it. Something new. A faint scratching, slow, deliberate. He turned onto his side, heart pounding, listening. It wasn't the trees, it was closer. Beneath him. The floorboards shuddered with a quiet, rhythmic scrape. Sam clenched his blanket tighter, his breathing shallow. He wanted to believe it was a mouse, some kind of animal, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded like fingernails, scratching. He stayed perfectly still, willing it to stop. The noise paused. For a few heartbeats, the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, from under his bed, the whisper came.
Sam.
He bolted upright, his breath hitching in his throat. The whisper had been so close, too close. Sam didn't sleep after that. He simply lay there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling until morning came. Leah had always been the responsible one. At 17, she had no choice but to be strong for Sam. He was only 12, and the accident had stolen the light from his eyes. He barely spoke anymore. Their uncle, Robert, tried his best, but he was distant, lost in his own grief. That left Leah to hold everything together. She missed her old life, the way things used to be. Now, even in broad daylight, she felt untethered, like a puppet with its strings cut. She caught herself staring at old family photos too long, willing them to move, to come alive again. But they never did. The next morning, Sam sat at the kitchen table, pushing cereal around in his bowl. His skin was pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion.
Didn't sleep?
Leah asked, pouring coffee into a cracked mug. Sam shook his head.
The house is loud. I heard something last night. Scratching.
Leah froze mid-sip.
Scratching. Where?
Sam looked up at her, his voice barely above a whisper.
Under the floor.
Leah set her coffee down, forcing a calm expression.
Are you sure? It could have been an animal. Houses make weird noises.
Sam frowned.
It wasn't an animal. It was slow. Like someone was dragging their nails across the wood.
He hesitated, then looked up at her.
I heard whispering, too.
Leah's stomach twisted.
Whispering?
Sam nodded.
It said my name.
Leah forced a chuckle, trying to push down the unease crawling up her spine.
You were probably dreaming, Sammy. Just a bad dream.
Sam didn't respond. He only stirred his cereal, his face unreadable. The floor behind Leah exploded. Splinters shot through the air, embedding themselves in her arms and face. She screamed as a hand, gray, elongated, and impossibly thin, burst through the floorboards. It clawed at the air, its joints bending with sickening pops. Leah scrambled backward, her heels slipping on the wood. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the thing pulled itself upward. First came its arms, too long and thin, the skin stretched tight over its bones. Then its head, unnaturally smooth, its mouth, a jagged gash that curled too wide. Its eyes were hollow pits of darkness, yet she felt them fixate on her, drinking in her fear. It whispered her name.
Leah.
The sound was wrong, twisted, familiar yet foreign, like someone speaking through layers of distortion. The creature moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking as it pulled itself fully into the room. Its grin widened as if it was savoring her terror. Leah's mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. Her breath hitched in her throat, muscles locked in place as an icy dread wrapped around her spine. The air felt heavier, thick with the stench of damp earth and something rotting. The creature's jagged grin widened, its two long fingers twitching in anticipation. A sickening clicking sound echoed from its throat, almost like laughter. Leah wanted to scream, to bolt, to do anything but stand there frozen, staring into the abyss of its hollow eyes. But she couldn't. She was trapped by fear, by the thing that had clawed its way out of the dark just for her. Then, as if breaking through an invisible barrier, her instincts surged. Leah snapped out of her paralysis, adrenaline shoving her body into motion. She turned and ran, feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted toward the hallway. The house seemed to stretch around her, the walls narrowing, the shadows lengthening. The thing behind her moved too, its limbs scraping against the wooden floor with a grotesque skittering sound. She reached the stairs and nearly tumbled down, catching herself against the railing. The front door. If she could just make it outside. The wind howled against the house, rattling the windows. But just as she reached the door, she felt it. Ice-cold fingers brushing against the back of her neck. With a strangled cry, she twisted away, throwing herself against the door with all her strength. The knob wouldn't turn. Locked. Number no. She pounded on it, screaming for help. The creature's breath was right behind her, its clicking growing louder, more eager. In one last desperate move, Leah flung herself sideways toward the window. The glass shattered around her as she crashed through, her body rolling onto the porch in a mess of cuts and bruises. She scrambled to her feet and ran until the house was nothing but a distant shape in the suffocating dark. She didn't stop. Not until she saw headlights in the distance. Not until she collapsed in the middle of the road, gasping for air, shaking, bleeding. She had escaped. Leah didn't stop running until she reached a gas station miles away, her body trembling, her vision blurred with panic. A kind stranger called the police, and soon flashing red and blue lights illuminated the parking lot. She could barely form words, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she managed to tell them about the house, about what was inside. Sam was still there. She forced herself to go back with them, dread clawing at her throat. But by the time they arrived, the house stood silent. The windows were dark, the walls undisturbed. No sign of shattered glass, no evidence of anything unnatural. Sam was found hiding in the hallway closet, shaking violently, his wide eyes unblinking. He wouldn't speak, not even when Leah hugged him, whispering frantically that they were safe. Their uncle, Robert, was furious when he arrived at the station. He accused them of overreacting, of letting grief get the better of them. But Leah wasn't backing down. She refused to return to that house, and Sam, still pale and wordless, clung to her like a lifeline.
We're not staying there.
She told Robert, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands.
Something is wrong with that house. You don't have to believe me, but we can't stay. We won't.
Robert hesitated, torn between frustration and something else. Something like fear. Maybe it was the way Sam wouldn't look at him. Maybe it was the bruises and scratches on Leah's arms. Or maybe, just maybe, the house had left its mark on him too. Eventually, he relented. They packed what little they had and left town before the sun rose. Leah and Sam moved into a small apartment on the other side of the state. It wasn't home, but it was far from the house, far from the whispers. For weeks, they barely spoke of what happened. Sam refused to sleep alone. Leah barely slept at all. Every creak of the floor, every shadow stretching too long under the dim light, sent shivers down her spine. She got rid of her phone. The unknown calls never stopped. Robert never mentioned the house again. He sold it within a month, barely speaking a word about it. But sometimes, Leah caught him looking over his shoulder, flinching at sounds no one else seemed to hear. One night, months later, she woke to Sam standing in the doorway of her room, his face pale.
Leah,
He whispered.
it's still with us.
Her stomach dropped.
What are you talking about?
He hesitated, then slowly lifted his foot and pressed it against the wooden floor. Tap, tap, tap. The whisper came, slithering from beneath them, just as it had in the house.
I found you.